As some of you in this audience know, I have dedicated most of my career to the examination of and struggle against racial domination in all its manifestations. I have written on racial theory, on the post-civil rights regime in America that I label the new racism, on colorblind racism, and this is a marvelous book that sells for $25, and that I'm willing to do cartoons. I have a son in college, okay? So I need all the money I can get, yeah? I have written a book on whiteness titled White Out. I have written on the idea that racial stratification in the US is becoming, slowly but surely, Latin America-like. And in the last 2 years or so, as Professor Cunningham mentioned, I have been a critic of Obama and Obamania from the left. And yes, I ended up voting for Obama. You're right, there were not many options, yeah? Today, however, I will present material from a book in progress where I address an entirely new aspect of racial domination. And I say new, maybe it's not new for some of you, it's new to me. I will argue that racial domination necessitates something like a grammar to normalize the standards of white supremacy as the standards for all sorts of everyday transactions, rendering these standards almost invisible. By doing so, this grammar helps reproduce the racial order of things as a non-problematic matter, as just the way things are. I'm convinced there is out there what I call racial grammar, a racial grammar that shapes in significant ways how we see, interpret, and even feel about race-related matters. Racial grammar, I argue, is a distillate of racial ideology and hence of white supremacy. Interested parties can read what I have written about racial ideology and colorblind racism. That's the book there, $24.95 in Amazon.com. But if you get it today, you get a sign and with a cartoon. And if I become somebody in America, you can put it on eBay. And if it goes for 100 plus, give me 10%, okay? To facilitate the discussion today, I highlight 3 elements of racial grammar that I want us to keep in mind. And I'm using the notion of grammar as a conceptual metaphor. So I'm not buying completely the linguistic term that some of you in academia we have been talking about for the last 20 years. First, if racial ideology furnishes the racial material that is spoken, it furnishes the racial material that is spoken, argued, and seen, racial grammar provides the deep structure or the logic and rules of proper composition of racial statements, and as I will suggest, of what can be seen and even felt. I know this is conceptual, but we have to go through the concepts before we get into the good stuff, okay? Second, albeit linguists produce manuals on proper grammar, so you remember in school being taught grammar and hating it, yeah? I suggest that most of the grammatical rules we learn through interaction and communication. So even people that go to school speak mostly proper because we acquire grammar through social communication. Third, no grammar rules completely any linguistic field, and thus it can change and even collapse altogether. The catalyst for this project was a very pedestrian and somewhat silly incident. I was part, now you see how silly it was. I was part of a Weight Watchers group, and we were told we had to begin with an accurate assessment of our weight. My wife and I decided to go to the local GNC store. All of you are familiar with these stores, GNC, the health store, okay. To weigh ourselves because they had what we regarded as a very reliable scale. After providing my age, sex, and height, the scale printed the following little morsel for me. You weigh 235 pounds and need to lose 50 pounds to reach your ideal weight. I'm a tall, muscular, large-framed man, so that verdict seemed inappropriate. Yes, I have issues. And although I believe I needed to lose some weight, that's what I was willing to join Weight Watchers, 50 pounds seemed like too much. Yet, the cold, presumably factual verdict, and it felt more like an indictment, yeah? You are overweight by 50 pounds, remained. According to this scale, I was overweight, I was fat, and far off from my ideal weight. In fact, my body mass index, or BMI, was 31, which was 1 unit above the lower range of those classified as obese. At least initially, and I must be honest, this scale's dictum depressed me, as I could not see any way I could come close to my ideal weight. So I'm a social analyst, but I'm also part of the world. So all these messages that we have been hammered for the last 20 years about thin, were affecting me. So all of a sudden it's like, I thought I was a little bit overweight, but 50 pounds, you know. So I got depressed. But suddenly it hit me. Did my African ancestry have anything to do with the whole thing? I'm a handsome black Puerto Rican man. Okay, the handsome is extra. Yeah. And how did this scale determine one's ideal weight? First, people of African descent in the US are big boned. That is, our bones are anywhere between 5 to 15% denser than the bones of white people. And please know I am not redefining or biologizing race. Sociologists in the room, race is a socially constructed category. I'm aware that it is genetically possible for phenotypically white folks to also be big boned. I'm just making a probability statement and limiting that statement to the US. So in doing this research, the beginning part, I check about this bone density matter in journals, medical journals, and the finding on the US is the US, it's not universal. So black folks in Africa and in the Caribbean don't have the same level bone density that we have. Why is it that African Americans have a higher bone density than blacks in Africa? That is not my business. I'm just reporting, okay? It's not a universal finding. And it suggests that we need to understand the connection between genetics and environment. Okay. Second, and most importantly, the scale made an assessment about my ideal weight based on presumably universal data. However, the universe used as the reference to develop the original notion of ideal weight was elite white people in Europe. They were and are the norm and the standard for almost everything out there. The formula for calculating ideal weight was developed in 1871 by Dr. Paul Broca, called the Broca Index. He was a French anatomist and doctor. But what many of the people who use this formula today do not know is that Dr. Broca, like many men of science of his time, was in the business of measuring difference between nationalities and races in terms of height, weight, skull circumference, facial height, and skull volume, to demonstrate, presumably, the superiority of European people. On his work measuring crania, Broca said, in general, the brain is larger in mature adults than in the elderly, in men than in women, in eminent men than in men of mediocre talent, in superior races than in inferior races. Other things being equal, there is a remarkable relationship between the development of intelligence and the volume of the brain. Broca assumed he could determine the relative position of races in the human series. Of course, as critics have pointed out, it did not occur to him that human variation might be ramified and random rather than linear and hierarchical. This incident and my quest to understand what shaped it made me think long and hard about the notion of something like a grammar affecting, if not directing, our cognition and even emotions on all sorts of racial matters, and posit whether such grammar is ultimately, and this is sort of my kicker, whether such grammar is ultimately as important as all the visible structures and practices associated with white supremacy. Let me offer a few examples of how the racial grammar of contemporary America organizes a racialized field of interpretation and vision. Like in the case of my ordeal with the scale at GNC, the subject of one of the chapters in the book titled Beauty and the Beast came to me out of an aha moment. I was watching the now defunct Nancy Grace show. Remember? Okay, some of you know Nancy Grace. You are guilty no matter what, yeah? And those of you who follow her know that she switched from CNN to CBS, so now she has a horrible show on CBS called Swift Justice. So I was watching this show. I'm hooked on TV big time. So, and this is what happened. Breaking news tonight. At yet another college campus, a beautiful 22-year-old president of the UNC Chapel Hill student body, double major, biology, poli-sci, last seen 1:30 a.m. doing homework, 5 a.m. shots fired. 20-year-old Eve Carson found dead out in the intersection near campus. Multiple gunshot wounds. Did you catch the problem with this statement? Probably not. That's what I'm here. No? The problem, as a few of you guessed, is with the adjective beautiful. TV hosts such as Nancy Grace seem to always describe a missing or murdered young white woman as beautiful. One of the beauties of being at Duke is that I have now a lot of students who assist me, that is, whom I exploit. So I told them, please check the transcript of Nancy Grace's show and the similar show on Fox News, Greta Van Susteren. Okay. So they checked the transcripts of Grace's and other similar crime shows, such as Fox, Greta Van Susteren, to see if there was a pattern, and found that in cases where young white women disappear or are murdered, such as Natalie Holloway, Chandra Levy, etc., the adjective was there. But when the victim was black or Latino woman, first, they are seldom discussed by the media, so they are significantly underrepresented in discussions. And when mentioned, the adjective is not there. This phenomenon, by the way, has been discussed by journalists, media critics, and minority victims group advocates. Roy Peter Black, Vice President and Senior Scholar at the Poynter Institute, a training center for journalists in St. Petersburg, Florida, said, sex sells, kidnapping sells, but not every kidnapping is equal. Sherry Parks, Professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland, calls it the missing white woman syndrome, and adds, quote, since we can solve all the problems, since we can save all the women, this woman, the white woman, becomes a symbol. This woman becomes a symbol, and if we save her for a few days, we are okay. The notion of racial grammar may help us understand the structure of this unsavory racial situation. First, stories about whites become universal stories about all of us. This is how whites imaginary frame these stories symbolically, but of course, this is not the case. When Lacey Peterson, you remember Lacey Peterson? Okay, so when she disappeared, and when Natalie Holloway disappeared, we all know her, and we got round 2 recently, yeah? Because they found that the guy who had killed her killed another woman, yeah? Okay, so when this woman disappeared, Latoya Figueroa, a black Puerto Rican pregnant woman from Chester, Pennsylvania, disappeared too. How many of you remember that name? One person, yeah? Good. So that shows you that this idea that our folks don't mean, it matters because we don't know the case of Latoya Figueroa, and why shouldn't we know her name? Why she should not have an equal chance of her case being discussed and helping to find her, yeah? Second, the beauty element in these stories reflects what Toni Morrison has articulated so well in novels such as The Bluest Eye, that all modes of representation in our current culture tend to idealize the desire for whiteness and devalue the presence of blackness. This social fact remains despite years of symbolic and practical struggle against white supremacy and its manifestations. Normative whiteness is still the not so hidden standard representing the cultural essence of 500 years of what David Goldberg calls racist culture. A culture that since Kant, Voltaire, Hume, and all the other enlightened white men of Europe and America depicted non-whites as ugly and whites as beautiful, sublime, universal beings. Now I provide examples from another chapter titled Watching Whiteness, White Movies and White TV Shows. The idea for this chapter came from a conversation I had 14 years ago with Emory sociology professor Dr. Tyrone Foreman, who was then a student of mine at the University of Michigan. He declined to join us to go out for a movie because he did not enjoy watching what he called white movies. I gave him what I now regard as a white line. So I told him, man, you see racism in everything. Like most whites, I thought, this dude is hypersensitive. A movie, after all, is just a movie. I now realize he was right and I was wrong. I realized how deeply I was affected by the racial grammar which prevented me from seeing the death of whiteness in movies and TV shows. The moment we turn our racial radar off is when whiteness seeps through stronger than ever. In terms of movies, Bell Hooks has argued that, I quote, to experience the pleasure that cinema can offer, blacks have to close down critique, analysis. They have to forget racism. Our visual culture expects, maybe even demands, that people of color suspend belief and become white-like. Otherwise, no soup for you. Okay, for the young people, that's a line from Seinfeld, yeah? So, no pleasure for you. On movies and TV shows, we have plenty of work from scholars such as Hernan Vera, Norman Denzin, Henry Gay, Darnell Montes, and Stephanie Greco-Larson. Both Vera and Denzin provide a historical interpretation of what they call the cinematic racial order, an order that evolved from civilizational racism, think about the early movies in the 1920s and 30s, yeah? And total whiteness, so you remember that even when you have blacks in movies, they were not black folks, they were white actors put in, dressed in black, yeah? To a modern cultural racism where people of color appear in a secondary role. That's what we have been at since the 1960s. Again, I will not delve in this subject. However, I will say a few general things. First, minorities are still underrepresented in movies and TV. Even in movies where we should be, we are not there or are there in a twisted way. How many of you watched this movie, 21? Okay. So, for those of you who didn't, this was a popular movie, 4 years ago? And it's a movie about these math whiz kids that go to Vegas and make tons of money. And as you recall, the main characters in the movie were 2 white kids. They made also a love story out of these 2 white kids. But if you go and read the original book from which this movie is based, you realize that all the kids involved in the story, and it's a real story, okay, were Asian kids. Why would the producers of this movie choose to have 2 white kids at the center of the storyline? Because they wanted to appeal to, and I quote, I went and checked, broader audiences. Second, when minorities appear, they still have to fight against stereotypical portrayals, portrayed as thugs, buffoons, angry people, etc. And Hollywood seems to never get it right. So even in so-called progressive movies, such as Avatar, yeah, which is portrayed as an anti-colonialist film, or The Blind Side, which is sold as a film showing the possibilities to get along, I think that they end up reproducing the racial order of things. In Avatar, the colonized, those of you, I'm assuming that most of you watch Avatar, yeah? Okay. Oh, apparently not. How many? Yes, okay, that makes sense. So in Avatar, the natives are saved by a neo-Tarzan white character. It seems that Hollywood can never allow oppressed people in the world to win a fight, yeah? That's too dangerous in visual culture, yeah? Having blacks or folks in anti-colonial struggles to win. So they always need a neo-Tarzan, yeah? Remember Tarzan? Yeah? White boy gets lost in Africa and becomes the king of the jungle. Come on, people. You know, that's some racist nonsense, yeah? So we keep reproducing Tarzan and now have neo-Tarzan. And in the latter movie, The Blind Side, race conflict becomes John's misunderstanding settled by the great white hope. Yeah, those of you who are of a certain age here, you remember that 20 years ago there was a similar movie called Mississippi Burning, yeah, which is paraded as an anti-racist movie. But in that anti-racist movie, who are the heroes? The white FBI agents. Hello, those of you who know history know that the FBI wasn't our friend. Actually, let me correct. The FBI is not our friend. Another stereotypical way in which black characters appear in movies is when they play the role of magic Negroes, black people who are given some power and whose job in the plot of the movie is to help whites navigate their lives. Think about Will Smith in Hancock. Remember Hancock? Some of you saw it? So here you have a black superhero who, how many of you saw the movie? A lot. So Hancock, before becoming a superhero, he's what? He's a drunk. Yeah? He's a drunk. And the drunk becomes a superhero. And if you really follow the plot of the movie, what is the plot of the movie about? Hancock has powers. He finds this white woman who he seems to be attracted to, and she seems to be attracted to him. They are about to kiss, and then she smacks him. And he's a superhero, and he gets a super smack. So all of a sudden we realize she's a superhero too, and that they had been together in the past. So the plot of the movie goes. But they realize that if they're together, their powers decrease. Therefore, the conclusion of the movie, let me spoil it for you all who didn't see it. The conclusion of the movie is these folks are happy when they are far apart because both of them have regained their powers. That's a way of reinforcing the racial order of things in a creative Hollywood way. Okay, so you have Hancock, you have Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost. Some of you watched that movie. Morgan Freeman in Bruce Almighty. Have you seen Bruce Almighty? A black man is God, presumably progressive. But in this movie, even though he's God, he's a magic Negro because this black God, his only job in the movie is helping the white character find his way. Or The Green Mile. Michael Clark Duncan, whose job is to help all these white folks with their sickness and disease. He still gets killed. Third, the storylines in films and TV shows tend to reinforce racial boundaries. Think about Friends, yeah? Those of you who are fans of Friends know that all these friends were white, yeah? And that whenever they brought minority characters, they lasted 4 episodes, yeah? Those of you who were fans, remember, you could predict, okay, how long this Asian girl will last? Oh, they have to kick her, and 4 episodes later, gone. Or Cheers, or Everybody Loves Raymond, except that Raymond didn't love black people, yeah? Etc. So minority characters seldom appear, and when they do, they last a few episodes. Or the movie Hitch. How many of you saw Hitch? Okay, popular movie with Will Smith and Eva Mendes, who is a Latina, dark-skinned Latina. Which shows that A, white-black romantic comedies are still a no-no. And B, that black-on-black romance is still regarded as a black movie. thus their choice for a black man and a light-skinned but still dark, so-called hot Latina, yeah? Think about what would have happened had they done this movie with Cameron Diaz. Why not Cameron Diaz? She's Latina too, no? You know that. You know why they didn't choose Cameron Diaz, yeah? Because Cameron Diaz has become, in the white imagination, what? White woman, therefore a violation of Hollywood codes, yeah? Or this movie bolstered the racial order of things. So if you watch America's Most Wanted, or you watch the show Cops, or you watch the local news. I live in North Carolina, so all the news about Latino guy arrested drunk driving, black guy killing, whatever, you know. So now we have systematic research showing how the news distort the reality of crime and the criminals, yeah? Or in reality TV shows, people of color are hard to find, and when we are there, we are depicted as pushy or hard to get along, like the case of Omarosa in The Apprentice. Or as what happened to most minorities in Big Brother. Those of you who are into reality TV know that you can also predict, okay, he ain't going to last or she ain't going to last, yeah? Or three, present a felicitous, simple-minded view of racial affairs. Think about body movies like 48 Hours, Lethal Weapon, I Spy, White Men Can Jump, and almost all of Jackie Chan's movies. So they create the impression that if we just get to know one another, we can become friends, because racism is just misunderstandings or not knowing the other well, and it's something that presumably we all have, yeah? Think about the so-called anti-racist movie Crash, a horrible movie, yeah? Because then it assumes that the problem of racism is prejudice that all of us have. So those of us who have made a career out of pushing the argument that racism is about power and institutional dynamics, were taken aback by that movie, which was portrayed by liberal folks across the nation and some confused progressive as a progressive racial movie, and it was not. Okay. As an aside, if you want to know why interracial body movies are made by the dozen, the answer is follow the money. Movie critic Jamie Malinowski stated in 2002, I quote, "The average gross of black and white body movies is about $102,000, while the $102 million, pardon me, while the average gross for all body movies was $67,000. So you make twice as much money making the interracial body movie. Sociologically speaking, and I haven't done the research on this, but I have a hypothesis. Why is it that we love these interracial body movies? Because they sort of allow us to fantasize that by just talking to one another in 90 minutes, yeah, we settle the racial problems of the country. So they are funny movies that make people laugh and keep them happy, thinking that, you know what, look at these guys. They started the movie being enemies, and by the end, they are like tight, yeah? So we fantasize. Nothing different to what we did in the Jim Crow period, where a lot of white people enjoyed sort of looking at what they thought was black life, yeah, in all these minstrel shows. Now I discuss material from the chapter titled, All of Our Children, in which I address the problem of child abductions. We know the names Elizabeth Smart. Who was Elizabeth Smart? Woman abducted where? Utah, yeah? Jessica Lunsford, a few years ago from Florida, and Sean Hornbeck and Ben Omby from the case in St. Louis, Missouri, a few years ago. But who amongst us recognize the names Alexis Patterson? Laura, you don't? Okay. Oh, okay, that's it. So, okay. But it didn't make the big, okay, it's Milwaukee, okay. I started in Wisconsin. I have a son who lives in Milwaukee. Yeah. Laura Ayala and Yahi Turner. These are the names of minority children abducted in the last few years, and only Alexis' case, the Milwaukee girl abducted 6 years ago, received any serious media attention. But the abduction of Elizabeth Smart, which happened at the same time as Alexis' abduction, received 6 times more news coverage. Is this because minority children are not likely to be abducted? Actually, about 20% of all abductions involve minority children, so one would expect that 1 out of every 5 stories about child abduction to involve minority children. Of course, some of the observed disparity in coverage is due to class, yeah? So not all children are viewed the same. Upper middle class white kids, like Elizabeth Mother, are viewed as, oh, this is a poor child, we need to deal with her, yeah? Yet I remind you that the white children in the Missouri and Florida cases came from poor families, okay? To sum up the issue here, I cite Alexis Patterson's stepfather, who stated before the 2002 National Association of Black Journalists convention that we have nothing against the other kids that have been missing. We know their parents hurt the same way we do and are grieving the same way. We want the same attention for our child so we can have just as much a chance of getting back as they do. Now I discuss some of the ideas of a chapter titled Bad Boys, Bad Boys. That is extra. When I sing, it's extra. Bad Boys, Bad Boys. School shootings in white, black, and brown. Although 9 out of 10 children killed in schools dies in urban, mostly minority schools, and although violent acts, murder, suicides, etc., are 11.5 times more likely in urban relative to rural and suburban schools, white America is morally distraught by tragedies such as the one in Columbine a few years ago. Why is this the case? Eugene Kane, a writer for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, there you go, said it best in a 2006 piece after the shooting in Cazenovia, Wisconsin, and an alleged plot in Green Bay. So he said, when tragedy hits a small town or city, the sympathy swells up for all involved. When young people die in Milwaukee's central city, too often the reaction from outsiders is to point fingers and blame residents for tolerating the violence. Can you imagine what would have happened if we, folks of color, when the tragedy happened in Columbine, would have said, those parents, they're not doing their job right. It's not even funny, yeah? Because it's not space for us to be blaming the parents. Yeah, he's like, come on, that's a tragedy. I'm like, what about my pain? What about my tragedy? Okay. He then added, suburban and rural white students caught in gunfire get immediate grief counselors dispatched to the scene. Black and brown city kids surrounded by violence have to resolve their emotional issues all by themselves. For those who believe these shootings are in fact different and thus ought to be treated differently, I urge you to read a paper, an important paper written in 2001 by Manifield et al. In Deviant Behavior. In the research, they document that even when one compares similar type of school shooting events, the media coverage is disproportional toward white schools. More significantly, the authors found the tone of the coverage is totally different. Articles dealing with shootings in white schools report the news in ways to elicit the sympathy of the readers, those poor kids in Cazenovia or those kids in Columbine. Yeah? Whereas articles dealing with shootings in urban schools convey the idea that these are yet more examples of the usual violence in urban America and betray a concern with accountability. Those parents in urban America are not doing their job. Yeah? And if your racialized imagination is telling some of you something like, well, I am not a racist, but aren't minority kids more likely to be involved in drugs, alcohol abuse, and in bringing weapons to schools than white children? So you are in for a surprise. Anti-racist activist Tim Wise, who is white, citing data from the Center of Disease Control, stated, white high school students are 7 times more likely than blacks to have used cocaine, 8 times more likely to have smoked crack. Some of this you're going to be like, what? Remember, this is not my data. CDC data. 10 times more likely to have used LSD and 7 times more likely to have used heroin. What's more, white youths ages 12 to 17 are more likely to sell drugs, 30% more likely, in fact, than their black counterparts. And it is white youth who are twice as likely to binge drink. Those of us in college know this for a fact, yeah? And nearly twice as likely as blacks to drive drunk. And white males are twice as likely to bring a weapon to school as are black males. These sobering facts led Wise to state, and I'm quoting, this is not my language, this is Tim Wise. I can think of no other way to say this, so here goes. White people need to pull our collective heads out of our collective ass. End of quote. Although this is a very cute statement, it is a profoundly sociologically flawed one. Why? Because facts matter very little on the things I have been discussing today. What ultimately counts in the real world with by race is whites' perceptions about blacks. Their perception of black men as criminal black men, to use the expression coined by Catherine Russell. And on this, as on other matters I have discussed today, the racial grammar of America prevents whites from seeing and accepting that their children are more likely to use drugs and bring weapons to school than black and brown children. I now discuss an example that is closer to home. HWCUs. You know what is an HWCU? Historically white colleges and universities like Rhode Island, Duke, Texas A&M, Michigan, etc., etc., etc. The racial character of HBCUs is tattooed in their very name. We believe these colleges are all black institutions. In truth, they are not. About 45% of faculty at HBCUs are not black and have a black agenda. However, we never ponder about the whiteness of the places we labor. We rarely question the history and practices that created and maintained these institutions white. Instead, we conceive them in universalistic terms, that is, as just colleges and universities. However, these colleges have a history, a demography, curriculum, climate, and a set of symbols and traditions that embody, signify, and reproduce whiteness and white supremacy. For example, most traditions in HWCUs, and I want those of you critical progressive scholars in the audience from now on to refer to these places as HWCUs. That is part of our counter-ideological political struggle. Yeah? So most traditions in HWCUs predate their so-called integration, yeah? And those are exclusionary, such as homecoming. And while some traditions are almost innocently exclusionary, such as Friday afternoon tea at Smith College, or yearbooks, this is a yearbook of my so-called alma mater in Wisconsin, circa 1971. You know it's 71 because of the haircuts, yeah? Okay. Other traditions are highly racialized, as with the offensive anti-Indian mascots that most whites fail to see as racist, yeah? So whenever we complain about these racist Indian mascots, then we are told, you guys are hypersensitive. Interesting sort of experimental work. A few years ago, some of you may know about this case, some progressive students in, I think it was in Colorado, had an intramural basketball team, and they call it fighting whiteys, yeah? Because everything will be all white or something like that. Sort of to begin a cultural fight about the symbols of the universities. And they got all kinds of, what is this? You cannot say this is anti-white. I'm like, okay, wait a second. Why you guys are hypersensitive? I thought it was a creative way of fighting back, yeah? The demography of these places is such that a black student interviewed by Fagan, Vera, and Imani in their book, The Agony of Education, stated after visiting a private college in the Northeast that one reason I didn't go there was because it reeked of whiteness, and that is no joke. I'm not exaggerating. I was only there for 2 days, and after 1 day, I wanted to leave. And I mean, really, it just reeked everywhere I went. Reek of all white men. Just lily whiteness, oozing from the corners. Then he laughed. I wanted to leave. And I knew that socially, I would just be miserable. And I talked to other black students. I talked to all of them, the 7 of them. Okay, I added that. I talked to all of them because there aren't a lot. It's like, being a place where there are only 17 black faculty. Yeah? And so, am I right in the count? And so I said, do you like it here? And they were like, no, we are miserable. The demography and symbols in HWCUs create an oppressive racial ecology where just walking on campus, this is important for whites, progressive and liberals who may not realize that, and I want to be able to carry a conversation. You may not understand or appreciate this, but I want you to imagine yourself to be in a place where all the symbols and traditions signify whiteness, and just trying to navigate those places. How do you feel 24/7 when you're in an HWCU? So they create an oppressive racial ecology where just walking on campus is unhealthy, where minority students feel, as one observer commented, quote, as guests who have no history in the house they occupy. There are no photographs on the wall that reflect their image. Their paraphernalia, paintings, scents, and sounds do not appear in the house. I travel across the nation, and sometimes they put me in the presidential room, to give my speeches, and they have the pictures of all the university presidents. And they're all white men, so I make a joke. Humor is very important if you are dealing with the matters I'm dealing. So I look at the pictures, and I go, oh, this looks like the Klan. And then I move quickly. You have to be quick, yeah? So you make the comment and you move quickly. Say, okay, let me talk about my work, yeah? This oppressive ecology is worse in college towns as the businesses in the area reproduce and reflect the whiteness of HWCUs. Hence, local businesses and even local people cater to white mostly interests, a practice that leads to a defending turf mentality. For example, 4 years ago, an employee at Ed's Express in Madison, Wisconsin, approached a group of black students eating dinner and told them, I'm sick of you people leaving piles of shit all over our tables, and added, I want you to leave the premises. I don't want you here. And that incident was important because my son was a student in Wisconsin when that happened, and it sort of shook him, yeah? It's like, oh, this is Madison, Wisconsin, which is supposed to be a liberal town, and this is what we're getting? What would it be if I was in Texas A&M where I work? I'm like, worst, yeah? In A&M, you would not be walking in these places at night because they become sort of, in Texas A&M, those of you familiar with that university, they have an area, North Street, and in that North Street is all bars. And as a faculty, I confess, I drink alcohol. So I would go with my colleagues and drink from 4 till like 6:30 or 7. By 7, I knew it was time to leave because the environment of the bars changes completely, increasingly becomes white. And by 10 p.m., it's like avoid the place at all costs. When I left in 2005, literally the month I'm leaving, there were reports of some students, presumably drunk, but alcohol is never an excuse for anything, shooting with BB guns at Asian students, okay? So that's the kind of behavior that, talk about an oppressive racial ecology. If someone is shooting at me with a BB gun, that's a bad place, yeah? And then I moved to Duke, and the summer I moved to Duke, they were burning crosses in churches in Durham, North Carolina. So I'm like, darn, wherever I go in these HWCUs, I'm sort of in prison. So I will write about other things in the book. Oh, that statue is at Texas A&M, and it's in the center of the campus, and that is called Sol Ross. He was one of the founders of the institution. He was also a slaveholder. Yeah. So think about, again, symbols and traditions. If you have a slaveholder in the center of the university and it becomes a symbol of the university, what does that tell people like me or like Professor Cunningham about our standing in that place? Yeah. And anytime that we try to say, you know what, we need to talk about this statue. Yeah. If you want to keep it, fine. But I want to have alternative statues that are more inclusive. Yeah. So it can reflect traditions of anti-slavery. And they're like, oh, that we don't like that. We don't like that. This is our statue. Okay. So I will write about other things in the book, such as be nice to me as I buy your stuff too, on race and selling commodities up there. We, the white people, a chapter on race and citizenship matters, and a chapter on when whites love a black politician, race and Obama, and a chapter on I want to adopt a white or Asian baby, on race and adoptions. However, I must have moved to my conclusion to leave some time for discussion and debate. Hence, let me conclude by articulating why I believe studying the contemporary racial grammar of the US is so important, and suggesting what we can do to fight this grammar, which weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. The racial grammar must be challenged because, like air pollution, it is hard to see clearly, yet it is out there poisoning us all. It affects people of color deeply. It affects our cognitive map as well as our sense of self. Are we beautiful? Who is the second woman? You don't remember? Vanessa Williams, yeah? Miss what? Miss America. But she's black, yeah? But she's a very light-skinned, black, green-eye woman. So change that doesn't mean deep change. Okay. Yes, the title of it, but that's for a different reason, yeah? As we recall, those of us who check the data on Penthouse, yeah. The what? Oh, yeah, that's true. And now we have had in the recent years other women that have had all kinds of issues, yeah. I personally believe that we shouldn't have any contest on beauty. So my concern is not just the blackness of the contest, is that we should not have freaking biggie. This is like sexism 101, yeah? And the fact we still have it in a society that claims to be beyond patriarchy is like beyond me. Okay. It also affects are we beautiful, and even our own bodies, how we deal with our hair, or hair politics. Here you have an example of, who is this? Sammy Sosa. So any difference between these two Sammy Sosas? One is a black Latino like me. The other one is a confused black Latino trying to be sort of like this guy, yeah? Needless to say, racial grammar shapes whites' racial cognitions too, and more deeply than it does folks of color. More importantly, the racial grammar prevents whites from truly empathizing with people of color. Otherwise, when our votes are stolen, as they were in the 2000 election, when the death penalty is applied to us at unbelievable high rates, or when our children are abducted and their stories are not mentioned by the media, forcing us to organize. This is a woman who organizes for cases of children who have been abducted, to try to force the media to pay attention to them. Yeah, our white brethren would be up in arms, as they would regard an injury to one as an injury to all. This human solidarity, unfortunately, does not happen because these horrible things are not processed, are not seen or felt by whites. In short, in whites' imaginary, these things are ungrammatical. They don't compute. But all forms of domination generate resistance. No? First, racial grammar has never ruled completely the grammatical field of the nation. Segregation, as bad as it is, has always provided what historian Lawrence Levine has labeled as the necessary space, the schoolyard for the development of alternative lenses to see the racial world. And within this space, people of color have developed an alternative racial grammar, which has allowed them not to get 100% trapped into spiritual or mental slavery, using the terms of Bob Marley. And through that grammar, people of color have challenged the white normative beauty standard, and in periods of heightened mobilization, provided counter-arguments such as black is beautiful. Or we have made movies such as the 2007 The Great Debaters. How many of you saw it? Oh, surprisingly a good number of folks, Produced by Oprah Winfrey and directed by Denzel Washington, where unlike in classic so-called anti-racist movies, Mississippi Burning, American Ace, or Crash, the heroes were not whites, but blacks themselves. If for nothing else, this is a movie that all of you should watch because it has a lynching scene that I think we should all be forced to watch. Yeah? Lynching is not dead. We still have a few cases every now and then. And it's part of our collective history that we should not forget. Okay? Events like this in human history we should know them and revisit them from time to time to prevent them from happening again. On TV, we have had shows such as In Living Color, the short-lived David Chappelle show, and the 5 years of HBO's The Wire. And yes, before you trash me, all of them had serious limitations, but they all provided frontal challenges to the dominant racial common sense. On the importance of challenging ruling racial dogmas, David Simon, producing of The Wire, and someone today told me he got the MacArthur Genius Award. Not that he needed that, he has all the money. They should have given it to one of us, yeah? So David Simon, the creator of The Wire and writer, said in his farewell letter the following. We try to be, how many of you watched the Wire? Okay. You know that it didn't do well when it was on HBO. It had done better now that many of us, like I never watched it when it was on HBO because I'm a cheap person, so I wouldn't pay HBO. But now I got hooked. So I got my DVDs and I locked myself in a room for like 5 days until I said, oh, this is great, yeah? We tried to be entertaining, but in no way did we want to be mistaken for entertainment. We tried to provoke, to critique and debate and rant a bit. We wanted an argument. We think a few good arguments are needed still, that there is much more to be said, and it is entirely likely that there are better ideas than the ones we offered. But nothing happens unless the shit is stirred. That for us was job one. Accordingly, we need to get busy to get job one done. We must develop an epistemology expressive of the movement to abolish white supremacy. Such epistemology of, if you will, racial emancipation is a necessary corrective to the Tarzanic logic and the racial grammar that reflect the moral economy of whiteness. But please know that epistemology and counter-ideological struggles alone have not liberated anyone in history. Hence, the task at hand for us in this peculiar and strangely contradictory moment in American history is to organize a movement of racial liberation, to work towards change we can truly believe in. Dominant grammars collapse when the oppressed fight back. Then, and only then, will the grammar of America be multicultural and reflect the views and interests of all of us. Thank you. Okay, we have some time for comments, questions, and I particularly, if some of you have ideas that I can work with, I welcome anyone telling me, have you thought about this? Because, and if you have references or you have written already some papers on that, send them along.
Okay, if you have questions, please line up here. If you're unable to line up, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic over to you.
Hi, I just want to ask something. You showed examples of how, entertainment is constantly, producing stuff that seems progressive but it's not. And you gave the example of Hitch, where I don't know if you had a particular problem with how it was Will Smith's black and Eva Mendes who was Latina, and they were together as opposed to like I guess pretty much my question is like, what would you think was a more progressive idea of black romantic comedy like that? I just don't know.
Well, that's the issue, that we make it into a black romantic comedy, yeah? So there are still some no-nos. Even though we have changed, presumably in significant ways, there are some limits to interracial relations. And producers in Hollywood know if you make a movie where you have a black man and a white woman, it will not do well in the market. Therefore, they sort of go back to the safety of, okay, if we have Will Smith, let's look for either a black woman, but if they have two blacks, then it becomes a black movie, and the marketing decreases. So what they did was, let's get presumably a hot Latina, yeah, that can sort of play the part, attract some whites to the audience, so that we can kachin, make the money. Again, think about what would have happened if they would have put Cameron Diaz.
Actually, if you remember, she was in that movie with what's his face, the guy from The King of Queens, and Kevin James, yeah. And that's actually interesting because that's probably why that movie did so well, because it had like two different parts.
Okay.
So for the honors class, we had to read one of your chapters, and it was I didn't get that job because of a black man. And I was talking with some of my coworkers today about you coming and kind of what you were saying in the chapter, and I wanted to know if you could go into a little bit more detail about the responses, like, well, I didn't own slaves, or yeah, my parents were racist, but I'm not.
Yeah.
I
I teach my own book in my classes, in part because, I need the money. But no, seriously, because I think I want to be humble, but I'm not humble. So it's a good book, okay? I think it's great. And the market has determined that it's good, the sociology market, so it's doing well intellectually and in terms of kachin money. So I teach the book, and I was telling some of the honor students who I had dinner with how I begin my book. So when I teach in my book, I begin by saying, I know that this book is hard for many of you because I'm not writing about racism during slavery or racism during the Jim Crow period. I'm talking about the way we think and process and talk about race today. So I'm going to play or role play one of you, and I want later on one of you to help me explain what is wrong with this position. And I say, I hate this book. I hate this class. I hate this professor. He forced me to buy his book. And on top of that, he's calling me a racist. And he doesn't know me. I'm a good person. Besides, the real racists out there are these black people. How come he's not calling them racist? Huh? He is anti-white. And then I step back and become Professor Bonilla-Silva, and I tell them in a calm way, okay, so you read the book. Let's deconstruct this. Let's explain what is problematic with this argument. And some of the students are like, I don't think it's problematic. I agree with that. I'm mad with this book, yeah? So, sociologically speaking, let me be honest with you. Let me do a confession. I believe that sociologists or social scientists doing good work should at some point push the envelope and antagonize segments of their audiences. If you are a feminist scholar doing gender work, some men should feel uncomfortable. If you are pushing for a class equality in America, some people in the audience should be like, I don't like that. That sounds like socialism. I don't like that. And similarly, if you're doing good race work, which is dealing with contemporary ways of thinking and processing race, some people in the audience should feel the way that my students feel. But I'm also, like all of us in academia, I'm into, let's have a civilized discourse on this. So let's explain whether or not, first, is this truly, as I suggest, a collective production? That is, when people say, I'm not a racist, but, or when people say, some of my best friends are, or when they say, the past is the past, is this a peculiar sui generis comment by one individual student, or, as I contend, a collective production? Again, the book appeared in 2003, so now we have 7 years of data. Many professors who use the book across the nation ask their students, I want you to go and interview 2 or 3 friends and check whether or not the frames of colorblind racism, the storylines, and the stylistic component that Professor Bonilla-Silva claims are part of colorblind racism, whether or not they have some purchase out there. And guess what they find? And if you talk to some of these folks, they probably were like, so what's wrong with that? That is true. The past is the past. Why are black people complaining, man? Slavery ended 100 years ago, whatever. They don't even know. Not 100. And so if you read what I write after I explain the storyline, I say, first, in whites' collective imagination, they assume that the problem of racism ended in 1865. So they have a historical amnesia. They're forgetting that after slavery ended, we went through 100+ years of hell called Jim Crow, okay? And secondly, they have another problem, which is the assumption that after Jim Crow presumably ended in the late 60s, early 70s, that racism disappeared. And racism has not disappeared. It has changed, but it still matters in jobs. Black and Latino folks experience discrimination trying to get a job about 50% of the time, okay? I don't even have to show up to experience discrimination. We have now experimental work done by Deva Pager at Princeton, where you send your resume, a fake resume, yeah? So you as a researcher control, similar background. The only difference in the resume is the name. So you put a so-called black name, Tyrone, versus John. And guess what happens? Systematically, Tyrone is significantly less likely to get the job, even though his qualifications on paper are the same as John, yeah? So yes, keep asking your friends. Maybe you can gather some data and send me an email so I can use your data.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. My question is similar to the first question that was asked about type of racial makeup in the film industry, and in article
in the what industry?
Film industry, movies, yeah. And in an article I read for one of my classes, it mentioned about biracial friendships in the movies, and the one example I can think of is the Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan, and from what I read in the article, it talked about how these friendships kind of misrepresent and give a sense of racial equality. But before I read the article, I don't know, maybe I was naive, but I really did believe that in some way these biracial friendships did promote some type of, at least path towards equality, and not really covering up, or maybe covering up some sort of historical, true accuracy of inequality. But, I really thought maybe optimistically that these were a step towards, especially in movies where there's, seen by a lot, that these would be a step towards equality.
And that's where I go back to my claim. And hopefully when you finish the article, you were like, oh, maybe I was wrong, yeah? So this is what I think, end up not helping. Because if you truly want to have interracial friendship, you have to begin by having a realistic understanding about how race matters in America. It's hard for me to associate with people who are going to tell me, oh, racism ended a long time ago. I'm not going to be hanging out with you because I get racism 24/7, okay? So these movies, and I suggested, why is it that we produce these movies? I can give you the sociological data. You know how many whites can legitimately claim to have black friends? Okay. If you do a survey and you ask whites, how many of you have black friends? About 40% of whites claim to have black friends. There are no other names. Yeah, he's my best friend. I forgot his name, but he's my really very best friend. Yeah. When you ask the question, first, do you have friends? Yes. List your top 5 friends. And then after you do that, you ask, how many of them are black? You know what the number becomes? About 8%. So what you have is what in my book I call the inflation of friendship, yeah? So we had some blacks in the samples and whites, so we're able to check how many of the people who claim to have friends, how many of these are real friendships, and how many of them are just acquaintances, yeah? And we found that a lot of the college students who had minority acquaintances promoted them to friends, even though in the discussion, in the interviews, they are like, yeah, that friend, he was my very best friend. I mean, we roomed together and I learned a lot. I learned about the black hair thing, and it's like, I learned a lot. And although after we stop the rooming, I don't see them, but if I see them on campus, I go and like, hey, what's up? Yeah. So if you truly want to deal with increasing the level of interracial friendship, what you need to deal is with how race works for real. Otherwise, we produce a fantasy land. Yeah. So if the problem of race is a structural problem of inequality, and you want to be my friend, deal with the reality of inequality, and then in that process, I will shake hands and party hard with you. But if it's just a Hollywood production to make us feel happy, I mean, the Hollywood, like most America, wants to sell a story. The problem of race is misunderstandings, yeah? All those movies have a lot of, the plot is, and these two people begin far apart. They don't like one another, they don't understand one another, they don't speak, Jackie Chan, yeah? I don't understand him, yeah? And by the end of the movie, they are best friends. So that is what Hollywood and white America wants. We, the minority folks of the world, what we want white America to realize is that race matters, that racism is a real problem, and if we want to be friends, join me in the struggle against racism, and then I'll be your friends for real.
Thank you.
Hi. Thanks so much again I'm just repeating what she said. My question is about the normative language of universal whiteness in the media. When you were speaking about it, I thought of in Hurricane Katrina, it was pointed out that when white people were taking things from stores, the caption was salvaging, and when black people
Looting.
then when black people were looting. Considering that the media is a group, but it's made up of individual writers. How do we, as an individual person, challenge what the media says?
Good luck with that, because the media is not really about individual writers, yeah?
Yes.
Media is owned by corporations. Mm-hmm. And here you have the intersectionality that Professor Cunningham was talking about. So capitalists, companies, corporations own the medias, and corporations also have a racial agenda. They are sort of white-owned and controlled capitalistic enterprises. So therefore, if you are a journalist who wants to do the right thing on race in CNN, Fox, NBC, CBS, etc., all owned by big conglomerates, I'm telling you, it's hard. Because when you try to push a radical race story, you're in trouble. The media prefers to have the happy face. Let's have these friendship stories, etc. And of course, there are pockets, yeah? So in CNN, what's her name? Latina. Soledad O'Brien. I don't particularly like what she's doing. I think it's as superficial as it comes. But this is the moment. In a moment where we have nothing, superficial stuff like the documentaries she puts out on, being black in America, part 1, part 2, etc., are better than zero. So let's say that you are a communications major, no, you're not? Okay. Economics, good. So let's say that you want to change the discourse in the media. I'm telling you that in order for you to do that, it will not be the heroic effort of the individual journalist, because that individual journalist trying to fight gender or race battles is likely to be fired. Yeah. So perhaps you do better by trying to develop a collective strategy. So there are a bunch of NGOs, etc., trying to point out the race and sex and sexist components of the media, and then sort of fighting and producing counter-ideological battles. And hopefully at some point, progressive folks on race, class, and gender, going back to the intersectionality, maybe it's time for us to develop our own TV station, yeah? And produce alternative news and alternative shows, yeah? I mentioned that I watch TV all the time, so I'm hooked with all these new shows that some of you are looking at progressives, such as Glee, yeah? Some of you are like, oh, Glee, it's so integrated. Really? How many of you watch Glee? Okay, so it's a new show, popular for young people, and you have black characters, you have gay characters, etc. But if you really pay attention to Glee, it's reinforcing the race, gender, class order of America in a new way. It's like being a college campus in America, yeah? We have gay folks around here, we have black folks, etc., and yet the normative order is reinforced. We cohabitate in these spaces, but we're not integrated, okay? So it's not enough to show my face. You have to challenge the racial, gender, sexual order of things. Okay. That was a good question.
I'm very sorry, but we have time for just one more question. But I want to remind you that Dr. Bonilla-Silva will be here signing
the books.
$24.99 right after.
Okay. Well, thank you. I know it's been a very congenial and agreeable presentation this evening, and I wouldn't want to disturb that as we would in the media, but I think tonight I'm the token contrarian who would like to question you on some of your theories. I see you're pushing the limits of defining racism, and you're pushing it from a psychological definition to a material definition, as I understand it. It's not, we're not looking to root out the bad thinker out there with those racist feelings. We're looking more broadly and saying in the society at large, racism is ingrained in the system. Is that a fair analysis?
That's a fair analysis of what I did 13 years ago. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, then, forgive me from noticing, but in reading your Linguistics of Racism, something like that was the name of the article you wrote, you had a excuse me? No, I'm providing a counterpoint to the professor's theory that racism, we're not concerned any longer with the psychological racism, we're concerned now with only a material racism. And I just an observation that you have one of the linguistic things that people like me apparently use in racial conversations is anything but race. That's one of the semantic moves that you describe. On the other hand, I believe there's a Vince Lombardi syndrome where people look at race isn't everything, race is the only thing. And I would counter that perhaps from your perspective, you're taking that tack as well. Much as the tool, the craftsman who has a hammer and everything he sees looks like a nail. It's just an observation that I've made. Okay, so we don't need any diversity of opinion. We don't need any counterpoint. What I would like to say is that your new theory of racism, that it's material, not psychological, is both clever and self-serving. It's clever because it requires no proof of invidious intent on the part of a racist, and only a statistical imbalance in the distribution of wealth need to be shown.
That's not, wait, let me interrupt you because since I have written a little bit on this, I'll tell you what I said. What I said was that race informs a social system, and therefore the analysis is not about intentionality. It's about the practices that reproduce positions in society.
I'm talking to
no, let me answer this question because it's important. So my theory, my material theory doesn't deny the psychological components of racism in America or in the world, yeah? So my theory really is not for the US, it's for the entire world system. And race has been part of the world system since the 16th century. So my argument is that we need to, if you want to understand a structure of race in any system, your job as an analyst is to examine what are the practices that produce and reproduce racial inequality economically, politically, socially, and even psychologically. That is what I said that's what I said 13 years ago. Because today I talk about something else, yeah? Today I'm talking a new terrain for me. I began by acknowledging this publicly. I'm sort of a virgin on this material, which is sort of the normative way in which race works, yeah? Race working at the cultural, cognitive level, yeah? How we develop these categories that we call the standards, and how those standards are racialized, and they work better because they become sort of invisible. So race as a standard works hegemonically. That's what I was talking about today. The question you asked me was about my general theory of racism, which I elaborated in an article in 1997 that appeared in the American Sociological Review. And in that article, I don't think it's self-serving. It's an empirical theory, yeah? So if the theory holds any water, and you claim that my arguments are flawed, what you do is examine the practices that reproduce race inequality socially, politically, economically, etc. And you tell me those practices are not responsible for race inequality. So let me give you an example. Imagine that you want to say that the reason why black folks are poorer than than whites is because of cultural deviance. Yeah, the culture does not allow them to advance as fast as white folks. So your task is to collect data showing that, and my task will be to suggest that that is not the case, and then empirically demonstrate. Guess what? Forget about your cultural argument when you have a situation of labor market discrimination. So we have all kinds of research that clearly documents at the economic level people with similar characteristics. For example, the case that I gave you, the professor at Princeton. Here you have a situation where a claim of cultural inferiority, which is sort of embedded in whites in America, that we people of color have an inferior culture, cannot explain why, when I submit my resume and I have a similar background as a person who is presumed to be white, why employers tend to favor the white candidate compared to the minority candidate. The same scholar did an even more interesting research where she sent, again, fabricated data examining what happens when you send records of people with criminal records versus people without criminal records. And guess what she found? If you are a black person without a criminal record, and you are a white person with a criminal record, guess who has the advantage? The white person with a criminal record. So based on the free market economy, and I told you that I studied economics, one would predict what? The person with a criminal record, the so-called invisible hand of the market, should slap him or her hard, yeah? You have a criminal record, you have no business in the labor market. I don't trust you. But in America, race has an independent effect, and even when you have a black candidate without a record, that candidate gets a lesser chance in the labor market. So we can disagree, but ultimately, as social analysts and social scientists, our task is to provide the data. So if your argument is counter to mine, your job is to produce data to explain inequities. They could be based on culture, they could be based on perceptions of so-called differences in intelligence, but it's not enough to just say your theory is self-serving, because I can say the same about your theory. Yeah? If you have a theory based on culture, I'm like, of course, you want to claim that my problem is cultural. That is self-serving too. But I would not say that about your theory. What I would tell you is, prove it, demonstrate it. So after I wrote my theory piece, again, 13 years ago, I moved for 13 years after to try to document what are the practices that maintain systemic white privilege in America at all levels. That is the test of civilization. It's not enough to do a theoretical critique. You have to then engage in the empirical repudiation. But on that, let me tell you, of course I have a way out. If my theory is material and structural, which I know irritates a lot of whites, because if I am right, and the problem of racism is a problem of inequality and power, the solution to racism in America, or in Puerto Rico, or in Cuba, or in Brazil, or anywhere in the world, is redistribution of resources. It is removing the practices, yeah, of inequality in America. So if we have labor market discrimination, it's not enough to say we have equal opportunity. If we know that discrimination is happening in the labor market, we have to deal with discrimination in the labor market. If we have, think about the wealth differential between whites and blacks in America. The average black family owns 1/10 of the net worth of the average white family. This is the sedimentation of racial inequality for 300 years. Even if we were to even the playing field in America, it would take 100 years for black folks to catch up with whites. Therefore, we will need to have drastic programs. Let me make a public confession. I support affirmative action, but I also have said that affirmative action is a band-aid approach to remedy racial inequality. As a program, it was not designed to settle racial problems in America. We have to go deeper. And the deeper alternatives are not supported by whites in this country. We could reconstruct, as we did, Europe. We presumably are trying to reconstruct Iraq, even though we're doing a damn bad job at reconstructing Iraq. But we have a problem imagining reconstructing Black America, helping our brothers and sisters achieve equality and parity in terms of resources and wealth so that then we can have a fair competition. We cannot have a fair competition when whites as a group have 10 times as much wealth as us. It's unfair. It's enough that I call that in my book abstract liberalism. Yeah, everybody is equal. Why should they have preferential treatment? Excuse me, we are not equal. We are not equal. We still have inequalities from the past and from the present. Okay.
I feel like I just had to go to war for the mic. But hello, my name is Elsie, and I'm a young Latina woman on this campus. I am Puerto Rican, and my father is Dominican. And being on a predominantly white campus is very difficult for minorities on campus. And I speak for all minorities on campus because there's not a lot of us. We tend to stay in the same social groups. And I have tried to make friends with white kids on this campus, and I have given up because I have been ditched. And it's just like I am not going to continue trying to be friends with someone that's, I tried.
That was a question that someone asked, yeah? It's not enough to be like, let's be friends. We have to understand how race works, for example, on organizations such as universities and colleges in the U.S., yeah? I can relate to your situation. And if you don't mind me hijacking your question, let's talk about this problem that white folks see in us self-segregating. Have you heard that?
Yes.
You people self-segregate. Why do you have a black dorm? Why do you have a Latino dorm? And the answer is simple. Whenever someone tells you that, tell this person, whenever you look at the black table in the cafeteria, look around. Do you see the white tables? I'm like, white tables? No, these are your normal tables. I'm like, no, they are white tables. Right. No. And you have white dorms. They're called fraternities and sororities. Yeah.
Right. Well, my question is that I just moved off campus, and two of my roommates happen to be Caucasian. One of which was raised in Woonsocket, which I guess she's in a predominantly white side of Woonsocket. Woonsocket has a lot of Puerto Ricans as well. And I have a lot of issues with her because basically she says what you said. I'm not a racist, but I stereotype, and she has admitted that to me. And I don't know how to go about living with someone who has such bad stereotypes on Spanish and black people. For example, she says, why are Puerto Ricans so prideful of their flag? I said, because their flag signifies where they come from and their barrios back home. But I don't know how to go about living and addressing diversity with someone who has no knowledge of black and Spanish
I'll answer
people.
this quickly. The onus is not on you to educate anyone, okay? You are symbolically, demographically, and for real, a minority student here. Your job is to survive first of all. And as a social scientist and a fellow Puerto Rican, I'll tell you this. Navigating an unhealthy environment on race, class, gender dynamics is killing, okay? I can give you the evidence of what it does to your health when you are dealing with perceived or real discrimination 24/7. It literally kills you. So since your job is not to educate others, you may engage, but you cannot be 24/7. Okay, you don't know about the history of American colonialism in Puerto Rico. If you want to understand why we're so proud of the flag, when your nationality is threatened, you then become hyper-ethnic. Yeah? You become more, and this, for example, Puerto Ricans in the island, like me, I was astounded by the nationalism of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. Puerto Ricans in the U.S. use the Puerto Rican flag more than Puerto Ricans in the island. Right. You don't know this. I'm telling you that. Why is that the case? Because Puerto Ricans in the island don't have, even though we're a colony, we are in our island. This is Puerto Rico, whereas it is you who are viewed as, what is wrong with you? So therefore you become hyper-nationalist to defend your sense of self. Otherwise, you disappear and you die.
Right, but my other question is, in Puerto Rico, there are a lot of racist Puerto Ricans.
I agree.
The black Puerto Ricans hide. What can we do to address these issues in Puerto Rico? Because it seems in Puerto Rico, you're loved if you are a light-skinned Puerto Rican.
By the way, that's not just typical of Puerto Ricans. It works with Dominicans. It works with Mexicans. So the logic of white supremacy has affected all of us in the world, okay? So we may fight collectively, we against them, we Puerto Ricans against them, we blacks against them whites, we Mexicans against Anglos. At the end of the day, the logic has affected us internally, so we're also stratified. So therefore, I'm not surprised that you and I, as black-looking Puerto Ricans, suffer from discrimination from our own people. Yeah, our own people are racially stratified, so white Puerto Ricans don't like me too much, yeah? So your job is, and I go back to the question of the previous person, what is the solution? Whether it's in Puerto Rico or the US, is the same. The struggle is a material struggle. We have to get equality by any means necessary, which means if there are practices that maintain inequality between blacks and white Puerto Ricans, we have to address them. If there are practices that affect our community in the US, so the Puerto Ricans in the US are also stratified, yeah? Not all Puerto Ricans are happy with one another. So we also have to deal with what is called in the literature, colorism, yeah? So the light-skinned Puerto Ricans think they're better than the dark-skinned Puerto Ricans. So we have a historic, gigantic struggle, but you know what? Nothing new under the sun. Nothing good happens without struggle. So our job is to be strong, to remain conscious, and to fight the power by any means necessary. Okay, I'm getting tired, so thank you.
And now we'll move on to the book signing portion of the evening. Thank you, Dr. Bonilla-Silva.
Kyle, you remember which one was my flash? I don't remember exactly. There are two. Oh, she knows. Is that there are two? You remember which one?
Yep.
I was confused because there are two.
Yeah, I know, because one's for the clicker.
Oh, okay.
Projectors, because we don't use presentation.
I just hope my phone wouldn't ring on you.
Oh,
no.
It has happened to me when sometimes I go and the phone rings in the middle and I'm like, hello? Who is this? I'm in a talk. Leave me alone. You know?